Hello, everybody. My name is Stuart, and once again, we're here with Frontline Foam to do another tutorial or assembly guide video. Today, we are building the Magpie. The Magpie is a seriously cool blaster. It's semi-recently released by Mr. Heath Pants or Heath or the MHPArms company, and it is a very impressive blaster. This thing has a lot going for it, some really cool mechanics behind it, and it's honestly leaps and bounds when it comes to mechanical design of a 3D printed blaster. What you see in front of me are all of the parts that you'll need to assemble the blaster from start to finish. We've got our wires, our parts for electronics, we've got all of our screws to throw it all together. But some things that you'll need, of course, are a soldering iron to get all the electronics worked out. You'll want wire strippers, maybe some super glue, some files, a screwdriver for sure. You're going to need some of these things. Some other things to note about this blaster are, I'm going to be honest, I've built a lot of blasters in my time here with Frontline Foam, from the most simple things to some pretty complex ones, and this one takes the cake for the most complex blaster that I've had to build yet. There's lots of little moving parts and little springs and mechanisms, so being very clear with you guys, this is a tough build, even for Derek and I here. So be warned. My personal recommendation, if you're not super comfortable with the challenges that may come, I would recommend you get this blaster from us assembled. For a bit higher of a price. You can save yourself the headache of having to build it, because when things go wrong, it can be a little frustrating. A couple other things to note are every 3D printer, even our 3D printers, print a little bit differently. Every filament prints a little bit differently. And there's so many variables when it comes to 3D printing. So my parts may not look exactly like yours. There might be one or two parts here or there that are just barely a little bit tighter or a little bit looser. So as we build this, you'll just have to pay attention to how your parts look and how they fit, and use your best judgment to see what kind of troubleshooting and fixing and sanding or not that you will need to do on your blaster as you build it. Another thing to note is, since getting these designs, we have actually made our own optimizations and modifications. In fact, the entire last week we spent just updating the files according to our hardware and our way of doing things. And a lot of that had to do with how printers print differently, and we use different nuts and bolts here and there. So do keep that in mind, that a piece of yours may actually have a bit of a difference. Beyond that, another thing to keep note of is, I don't know the names of all these parts. There's lots here. I haven't learned them all yet. So I'm going to kind of call them what I want for now. And hopefully it doesn't get too confusing as we go. Keep in mind, as much as I have a lot of experience building these blasters, and I've built a good handful of Magpies already, just know I'm not perfect at this. I make mistakes, and if something goes wrong, I'm going to try my best to show you guys my process for solving that problem. But do be aware, I have a lot of resources here that I'm going to try and use to make things go as smoothly as possible. So keep that in mind as we go. The way I like to go about building this blaster is actually taking a part at a time and focusing on kind of building that module, and then moving on to the next bit, getting that module built, and then moving on to the next bit, and then getting all the kind of modules prepared, and then throwing it all together to get some troubleshooting done. So just be aware that's kind of the overview of how things are going to move. So we're going to go ahead and start with this far left panel to put together the drum release system. What we're going to do first is we're going to look down this channel in here and make sure that the supports are out, because this piece actually needs to go through there. And as you can tell, we can't see any light through there, so that means that there's supports still in there that we need to get out. So let's take care of that. There we go. We can see right through it, and this hole up here is clear as well. So we're going to take this little arm connector thingamajig, and we're going to slide it up through here and kind of push it over that ridge, and boom, it's in place. It moves decently freely. That's what we want. And we're going to take this little thumb release button thingy, and it's gonna go like so. There's gonna be a screw that goes through here and a screw that goes through here. And we have kind of a 3/4 length screw, a 1/2 inch or a half cut screw should work. But we're gonna use this screw to connect the two orange pieces together. That's gonna go right here. So we got our screw in there. Something to note is that if you tighten it too much, you're not going to be able to twist this part very easily, and we want it to be able to twist. So I'm just going to loosen it a hair, and there, now it rotates a bit easier, and that's what we want. Now we're going to take this screw and put it into this spot. This is just a normal full-length screw. And I took this screw and I screwed it in just enough for the screw to barely pop out the back. Like I can feel it, but I actually haven't finished screwing it in all the way because it's going to go into something else later. So we're just going to leave it like that for a bit. It's still serving its purpose as of now. Next, we're going to take this little drum peg and it's going to sit up against here like so and be connected by a screw. And this is just a full-length screw. There we go, we got the screw in there. It's nice and attached. Make sure the peg sticks straight out this direction, that's not crooked either way. We want it to be nice and straight. Looking good. Now what we're gonna do is we are going to tuck this spring, you kind of pinch it, and then you stick it behind this orange piece and pin it between the black and the orange here. Now, as you can see, it's spring loaded. Don't do this too much, it might pop out. And make sure, yeah, so our spring's nice and tucked in there. Now we're gonna take this cover piece, and it's actually got a groove here for that spring and such to fit inside. And we're just gonna throw it right there. And it sits like so, and we're gonna put in 2 full-length shell screws right here. Careful not to strip these. There we go, the screws are in there. Make sure that when you screw yours in, that the heads don't stick out. If they do, they can rub against the drum later, so make sure that they're all the way in there. Okay, so with this put together, we're gonna just attach it to this panel here. Make sure all this is nice and cleaned up, there's no gunk hanging around. And then as you can see, it's gonna slip in there, like that. And we're gonna bolt these together. The screw that I mentioned earlier, we're gonna continue so that these 2 plates attach. Remember, we're not gonna tighten it too much because we still need to be able to move this. And we also don't wanna tighten it to the point that it pops out of this side. So we can honestly just leave it right there. Maybe just a little more actually. There we go. And we're also gonna put a screw right here. This screw can be full length and it can go all the way in. It's gonna stick out, but don't worry, it's not gonna get in the way of anything. Some screws are really easy to strip, so be careful not to tighten anything too much. And one more screw here. There we go. So now these 2 plates are nice and secure together. All right, now what we're gonna do is we are going to assemble the right panel and hammer area. This is a bit complex, so try your best to follow along. What we're gonna do first is this is a standard caliber and pin, 1/16 diameter. We're gonna cut this clean in half. We're actually only gonna be using 1/2. And the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take the half of this pin and we're gonna tap it into this hole right here, this little one. We have thought about we changed this to a pin and now we're thinking about changing it back into just a screw. So chances are when you get your kit, you'll just have to put a screw in here and you'll put it in most of the way just so the head pops out basically, like so. But we are going to use a pin for the time being. And as we tap this pin in, we just want it to stick out about that much. We don't want to hammer it all the way through and break anything. We just want it to stick out enough for this spring to be able to push against it and feel some resistance. Once again, this might be changed to a screw in the kit that you receive. Now we're going to attach the rotator arm. We're simply going to take a screw, put it through the rotator arm, and then into this hole at the bottom here. This screw, we want it not to stick out from the top, but we also don't want it to be so tight that we can't spin this around. This needs to be able to move freely. Additionally, if it's in there all the way but still too loose, we can have too much play on the arm and it'll fling everywhere, and we don't really want that either. So you got to find the nice middle ground. We're going to flip this over now, and this little ratchet mechanism is going to go like so. And we're just going to do, just like the rotator arm, we're just going to put a screw through there. So my screw was just barely too long. I'm going to snip this just a little bit shorter and put it back in. But we will make the optimizations, so ideally you won't have to do this. But do pay attention, make sure that the screw goes in all the way, and then make the necessary adjustments that you might have to. So same for the rotator arm, the same rules apply here. We want to be able to spin this, but we don't want it to stick out. So ours is barely on the edge of sticking out, so I'm going to bring it in just a little more, and we still have good movement here. Looking good. We are going to install the pusher. Now, the pusher is going to feed through this slot, and most of the time, it's really tight. It's going to have a lot of friction going on, so I highly recommend that you take a file and you lightly just file out this entire area that it's going to be, this channel that it's going to be passing through, to help it be a smoother glide. There we go. So that's much smoother. Usually it's just like a little hair or two from the printer left over from the filaments or something. So it doesn't take much filing at all, but you want it to be able to move freely, but we also don't want to file it so much that it wiggles in its place. We don't want that. What we're going to do now is we are going to open one of the loops of this 1-inch spring, just like that, not too much. And we are going to feed it through this groove of the pusher, and then we're going to pinch that closed again. Just like that, nice and easy. And that's not coming off. Now what's going to happen is this is going to sit here, but first the pusher is going to be in here, and we're going to feed the spring through this channel in the hammer, like so, just like that. And we are going to take a half-length screw and put it into this hole here. The one on the inside, not on the outside. Now, I recommend that you leave this screw sticking out a little bit. It's not a big deal if it does, because we need to grab that loop of that spring in there and bring it around the screw out here. But before I do that, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take everything off, and I'm going to lubricate the common friction surfaces. The common surfaces are in here, in this entire groove where the pusher is, this entire area, this peg, or in other words, this hole in the hammer, and kind of all around the hammer except for on the top here. It's better to be safe than sorry, and it's nice to get the lubrication out of the way, so we're going to do that. Another important surface to lubricate is actually right here. Now we've got things greased up a bit. We're going to go ahead and throw it together like we did earlier. Give it a little bit of motion just to get the lubricant spread around to where it needs to be. This part's a bit tough. We're going to reach in, grab that eyelet of the spring, pull it out, and then hook it around the screw there. Might take a couple tries, but don't worry about it. Just giving it some movement to help the lubricant spread. Looking good. Some things to check for already. We want to make sure that our rotator arm is sitting in that groove. There's actually a little groove beyond this little rectangle, and that rotator arm should sit all the way in the groove. If it doesn't, you may need to file it just a little bit wider or make sure that the supports aren't there anymore. Also, additionally, just make sure as you come to kind of this point right here, there's kind of a click. Make sure that click isn't too aggressive. Make sure that that lubricant's really doing its job. So that way things aren't too tight, because the trigger alone is going to have to move all these mechanisms. So if it's too tight, we might actually snap our trigger. So we just want to be aware of that. With that, we're going to put this plate over this side. And as you can see, these holes and these holes line up. So we're just going to throw a screw, a full-length screw, all the way into this hole. It's okay that it sticks out the other side. It's not going to get in the way of anything. Now, this hole, we are going to put a screw in just to keep this thing from spinning around, but we're not going to put it in all the way. We're going to put it in just enough to secure the two together. There we go. All right, so now that we've got the two halves ready to go, we're going to prepare the trigger. This is a tough part, so there's going to be lots to go over here, and hopefully ours goes well. Firstly, we're going to take this pin here. Maybe yours is printed, but we've been using these recently. They've been working really well for us. We've occasionally had to drill out these holes on either side to 9/64 to be a smooth fit, as well as the hole in the trigger. But we are working on optimizing the file, so that won't even be necessary. So just look at yours and see how it fits and make sure it does. We are going to also work on optimizing these files, so that way the pin fits as is. However, as of right now with this version that we're working with, I am going to need to cut just a little bit off of my pin. And if you have to do this too, make sure that you clean it up afterwards. So I'm going to go sand this. Okay, so we've got our pin at the proper length, nice and cleaned up. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this little spring. Heads up, yours may look different, but it's going to be the smaller one. And we are going to open the eyelet just a little and put it through this hole on the trigger, and then close it back up. There we go. It's not going to come off now. Next, we're going to take this half-length screw here, and we are going to put it into this hole down here, this bottom one. And this spring, the trigger is going to sit like so, right? This spring is going to hook around this screw we just put in there. Now, here's a trick. Chances are we're going to have to take this thing apart and put it back together again several times to get everything troubleshooted and working. So what you can do is you can kind of push on the screw as you go in to get it to go in kind of crooked, and it'll actually kind of press against the wall down here, and it'll make it harder for your spring to pop out. So I'm going to do that real quick, make sure it works a little better. And now here comes the fun part. We're going to put our pin in here. Ours is a little loose today. We're working on those files. That's not a problem. And this is going to slap onto it like so. The pin is going to go through this trigger into this print, into the hole there. And then, this peg as well is going to fit into the hammer there. So just watch everything as it goes together, and careful not to force anything. Kind of be its friend and help guide it. Just kind of watch and look at what's getting in the way, what's not. There we go. All together now. And now if we pull the trigger, it should pull the hammer back. And as we finish pulling the trigger, the hammer should slam forward. And then when we release the trigger, it should click back. There we go. There's the click, or there's the hammer slamming. Now if I let go of the trigger, okay, it didn't click. What's supposed to happen if I give it a little bit of help, it's supposed to do that and re-engage the little ratchet spring in there. But at the very least, we know that the pusher and rotator arm are working correctly. and that the hammer is also snapping as it should. The only trouble is the trigger spring that we have installed is not strong enough to reset this arm here. Basically what happens is, as the trigger goes forward, it turns the hammer, but when it comes back, it pushes against this to turn the hammer, so it pushes right here. Now when it comes back, it needs to be able to push this out of the way and then snap past it back into its original position. And if this is too strong or if this is too weak, it's not going to have the strength to do that. And you're going to sit there pushing your trigger forward yourself between each shot. And that's not ideal, obviously. So there's a number of things we can do. We are currently working on finding the perfect spring to get this to work first try. However, as of now, we're not quite there yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you some other tips that can help. Firstly, is we're actually going to weaken this printed spring here. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to squeeze it like so until I see it barely turn white up there at the top. That means it's creasing, right? And now, as you can see, it's actually got a little bit of play now. And that's what we're going for. We don't want too much, and we definitely don't want to break it, so do be careful. But we're going to throw it back together now that we've weakened this spring, and we're going to give it another try. And truth is, this is one of the hardest parts, is getting this trigger to reset properly. Because it does take a lot of trial and error. You got to find the perfect middle ground. So ours still isn't clicking all the way forward. I still have to help it. But if you notice, if I just release it and let it flick forward, it actually does reset. But once again, that's not ideal. So basically, what we're going to do for the next few minutes is we are going to be troubleshooting this. We are going to be squishing the spring a little more, or we're going to be checking to make sure we're all lubricated nicely. We're going to be looking at things as we go, but most of the work is going to happen here. And that's going to be finding the perfect amount of tension on this spring, so that way when the arm on this trigger comes back, it can push it out of the way, but we don't want it to be so floppy that it won't even engage in the first place. So kind of long story short is squish this a little bit, try it again, squish it some more, try it again. And then if it stops engaging at all, loosen it, or rather tighten it again. So pull it out this way again, try it again, and try and find that perfect middle ground. However, we're working on finding the perfect spring so that you don't even really need to troubleshoot it that much, or hopefully at all. So here we go. I'm going to be doing this for a bit. So we've run into a bit of a hiccup here. I've been compressing this spring back there, squeezing it, trying to get it to be looser, and I've come to the point where it almost resets. Like I barely have to help it, but now the issue is that this trigger is now stuck. And that's because the two arms are just hitting each other like this instead of pushing one another like this. So it just kind of jams the trigger. So careful not to force it if this does happen to you. What I may do here is I might actually try a different spring. We're still in the process of figuring it out. I may cut the spring shorter. That's something you can do too. You can pull the spring out a little bit, snip a little bit off, make it a little bit shorter, and try it again to get a little bit of a tighter spring. So I'm going to do that for a bit as well, and we'll see how it goes. Once again, hopefully at this point, you will have figured it out because we've sent you a better spring. So, okay, so after fiddling with it for a few minutes here, I think I've got it to somewhere where I want it to be. You may have noticed that I started grabbing this handle as I was working with it. You can very easily just kind of slide it on here, and it kind of stays. But it can kind of spare you from getting your fingers your hand all poked up and cut up with these edges here. So you can slide it on like so and use that to try it. But listen closely. This is what we're going for. This is the goal. We want to be able to pull the trigger all the way, not too much resistance. We want to feel things pretty smooth. And then boom, that click. And then when we let the trigger come forward, it clicks back into place. Remember earlier how I had to push it forward with my finger? Now I can just let go and it comes all the way forward. So This one isn't absolutely perfect, but I'm seeing that it should be satisfactory. There are a couple times where it might kind of snag up, but later, as we install motors, there are vibrations from the motors and flywheels that can help things kind of just settle to where they need to be. And if it gets worse later, I can always pop it back open and give it another try. There we go. Okay, now what we're going to do with this trigger out of the way is we're going to put together the cage. This cage is really nice. It's really open, so it's easy to work with. We're going to take our two Honeybadger motors and we're going to kind of click them into their holes. Make sure they're all the way in there. As you work with these motors, be careful not to bend these tabs too much. They are pretty delicate and can snap. So we've got them all the way in there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use this little protective cover and set it down in there. That just protects the tabs and everything. And we're going to take a bit of Loctite. This is optional. You can do so if you want. It's just sometimes the vibrations from the motors can cause these screws to pop out. I'm just going to put a drop in each hole. Then I'm going to throw in these 4 motor screws. These motor screws, you do need to be careful and make sure that they actually catch into the motor and thread correctly. If you cross thread or strip them, it's going to be a pain to get that working afterwards. So you just make sure you go straight down into the motors and that you get it nice and hand tight, pretty snug, but not too much to the point of doing any damage. All right, with those motors nice and secure, really in there, we're going to press on the flywheels real quick. Now, I've got this vise here. This is a bit overkill, honestly. You don't need this, don't worry. But we've got this little tab that should have printed with your blaster. This is going to show us the distance that these flywheels should go on. So if we push on these flywheels as hard as we can, it'll hit this plastic first, and that's the exact gap that we want. Just some general need to knows about flywheels is these are Flywheel the Wheel flywheels, FTW, and we're going to install them, and results may vary, honestly. Sometimes these can be just barely unbalanced, and that might leave a little bit of vibration going in your blaster. That's not a huge issue. It can lead to a bit more heat buildup in your motors, given that these are Honeybadgers and they spin pretty fast, but it's not a huge concern. However, if your cage is nearly jumping off the table, that's probably a bit too much vibration. The focus is to make sure that you push on these wheels directly, like straight on with the motor shafts. If we push them on crooked, obviously, we can risk bending the motor shafts or just having crooked flywheels, which leads to vibration. That's why I have this guy, just to make things easier. If you do have crooked, or if there are lots of vibrations, it can help to take a flywheel off, and usually I recommend sliding something like a knife or a thin screwdriver like so and prying it off with leverage gently. You can take a flywheel off and you can spin one of the motors and see which one's vibrating, and you can actually, sometimes I've found that if you take the flywheels off, switch them, put them on again, flip them upside down, put them on again, and just kind of fiddle with them, eventually you can actually find a sweet spot that won't vibrate much at all. So those are some overall tips for you. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started on this. So I like to start these by hand. Just nice and gently straight down. There we go. So they're on there, but they need to go further, so I'm going to use this guy. There we go. So we can tell that the motors are all the way up against that plastic, but they're not like super tight. Like I can still pull this out, and they are even. If they're uneven, your blaster can shoot pretty awkwardly, almost crooked sometimes. So we've got these flywheels on. They're spinning okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to prepare to solder. So to solder this, I'm going to secure the cage right here in my vise, just so it holds still. Just makes it easier to work with. It's not going to move around while I try and solder it. Some overall need to knows about soldering are, I'm not perfect at it for sure. My soldering can almost be kind of messy, but my goal is always functionality and durability. If you don't know how to solder, I highly recommend you just look up some videos on how to. It's probably much better than me trying to explain it all to you. But what we're going to do is I'm going to mark where these wires are going to connect. And make sure, by the way, that these red dots are opposite each other. If they are not, there are going to be issues. Just going to mark these where I'm going to strip them. And I'll show you how I like to do it. I like to just, of course, take that off, obviously. But then for this one in the middle, I pinch it at one end and pinch it at another, give it a wiggle. And then I take it off with my fingernail. And then as we clean them up, we're just going to twist them so it doesn't fray on us. Compare it to the tabs. Okay, that's going to line up, and do the same thing over here. Okay, so these wires are going to go onto the motors like so. So what we're going to do is we're going to tin these four surfaces and these four surfaces and then join them together. Okay, so we just finished soldering, and this is what we want it to look like roughly. Notice that I kind of added a bend here because these wires are actually going to feed down here later. Not entirely necessary, but it does help for sure, just to make sure it doesn't extend over this edge, but that's what we want it to look like. Okay, now that we've got our cage wired up, what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to test these flywheels, test the motors, make sure everything's working okay, because it's easiest to remove and reattach flywheels while the cage is not in the blaster, of course. So what I'm going to quickly do is I'm going to strip these two ends, tin them real quick, and then use the Lipo to test them. It did sound a little awkward. It wasn't unacceptable. That definitely will fling some darts pretty fast, but I want to go for a little better. So I noticed that there was some actually up and down vibration going on. Technically, these can move just a little bit, and I could tell that there was some side-to-side vibration as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to be, like I said earlier, I'm going to pop them off, throw them back on, isolate the problem, and figure it out. By the way, I have this special tool that's a modified version of this that lets me press the flywheels on even after it's soldered. We're going to try and get these in the hardware kits as well, so you can use these. Okay, so we've got this flywheel. We took it off and put it back on a couple times, and it's sounding a lot better. Have a listen. There we go. And it's not heating up too much. It's always going to heat up a little bit, but not too much. And let's try the other one. Let's fiddle with this. Okay, things aren't perfect, to be honest. They're not absolutely perfect, but we've definitely gotten these wheels to an acceptable point. Have a listen. There we go. So we'll call that A-OK for now, and we'll move on. Okay, so we've got the cage done, we've tested it, we've worked with the flywheels. Now what we're going to do is we are going to continue the soldering, but in order to continue the soldering, we actually need to assemble it a little bit. So what we're going to do first is we're going to take this right barrel piece, and we are going to attach the cage to this piece. It's important that we feed the wires correctly, however. This piece, there actually used to be a little tunnel right here, a little guide where the wires would pass through. Unfortunately, it broke off when we were cleaning out the supports. That's fine. But yours will likely have a little bridge right here that you're going to tuck the wires underneath. So I recommend that you do that first. You tuck the wires underneath and you pull them out this side. And then you're going to bring the wires into this little corner here, like so. And the cage is going to slip on like that. So the wires tuck down there, come out this side, and pop out this way. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put a full-length shell screw right there to secure it. There we go. It's on there. Make sure that you can spin your wheels, that the wheels aren't rubbing against the plastic. It's very unlikely, but do be sure and make sure there aren't any supports left over in here. Make sure that your wheels are on all the way. So boom, we've got that attached. What we're going to do now is we're going to tuck these wires back there as if they were under that bridge that I talked about earlier into this groove. And now they're going to feed into this trigger mechanism that we built earlier. This is a tricky part though, because we're going to have to split it open again. I know we just got it together and working, but we do have to take it apart again for this next bit. So we're going to take that off and we're going to slide this guy. As you can see, he fits into this groove. And that's why we left this screw unscrewed a bit, because we're going to finish it off and drill it into this barrel piece. But remember, we're still not going quite all the way because there's still a couple more turns left. And that's actually going to go into the next piece. We want those to thread correctly. So we've got these attached. Do be gentle. It's not the strongest thing in the world. We're going to tuck these wires in their grooves. Make sure that your wires aren't protruding into the motors, or the wheels rather. And the wires are going to feed all the way back here. And the switch is going to sit right here. So we need to snip one of these wires to the exact length to come in touch with this connection right here. What we're going to do is we're actually going to bend this connection outwards just a little bit. Like that, roughly. And we're going to kind of line everything up again. We put the switch in its little cutout here. Nice and snug. It's going to want to jump around. Make sure that your wires are all tucked in, especially right here. Make sure that the wires are on top of one another, that they aren't sticking out this way. And we're going to choose a wire to cut here. I'm going to go ahead and choose the red one. So I'm going to bring the black one up here. And I've got everything in place. I'm looking at where it's going to connect, and I'm going to snip it right there. Because that is where it's going to come and meet with the switch. So let's check that. I like to err on the long side just in case, because it's easier to shorten a wire than it is to lengthen a wire. So if this comes around, okay, that looks pretty good. It looks like we can still make it a little bit shorter, so I'll go ahead and do that. So I've got the wire to length. I've kind of made sure it's the right distance. And now what I'm going to do is strip the end, tin the end, and attach it to that prong that we bent on the switch. We're going to start using our heat shrink now, so cut a little piece off to use on this bit. Okay, so we've got it attached. We're going to make sure that our length was correct, make sure everything fits. So put the switch back in its place. There we go. And we tuck the wires in, and that looks good. Looks like it's all going to work out. Awesome. Now what we're going to do is we are going to clamp down the switch again and connect something to the other side. This elbow out here is what we're going to connect to next. For this video, am just using some scraps of wire that we had. However, we're going to make sure that when we send you a kit, it is the correct length of wire to do the whole thing. So there's a small chance I might have to splice a little bit of wire, but chances are you won't have to. So we're going to take a long bit of wire, strip it, and we're going to connect it to this switch here. And this is optional. I prefer to solder it like so to connect it to the switch, but you can also do it like this. Like I said, I just prefer it this way. So we've got it all attached. Now that this side is cooled off a little bit, we're going to slide the heat shrink onto it. That sounds counterintuitive, but I like to wait for it to cool. So that way I can make sure it's all the way on there, and then I use a lighter to make it shrink down right where I want it to be. And cut another little piece to cover the elbow that we just soldered. There we are. Now we're going to tuck all the wires away, hopefully once and for all. Just like earlier. This is a bit tough, okay? So the switch is actually going to sit over this black wire here. So we're going to feed the black wire first and point it out the bottom like so. Hopefully you guys can see what's going on. It is black on black, so I imagine that's a bit tough, but like so. And then the red wire on top of it. Just like that. So as you can see, the black wire is actually coming out from underneath. It's feeding underneath the teeth of that switch, the prongs. These wires are flat. They're not sticking out, especially right here because the trigger is going to be here. And these wires are going to come out into the handle. We're going to have to splice this one. Hopefully you won't, because we'll give you a long enough wire. All right, so I just spliced this real quick to get it to length. But we've got all of our wires tucked in. And what we're going to do is we're going to throw the trigger half back on to cover it all up. There we go, all clicked into place. And what we're going to do now is we're going to test and make sure that that trigger is working properly, because now that we've added the wires inside, things can actually move around, and we don't want that. Oh, and one more thing. We're actually going to put a full-length screw in this hole right here to secure that switch. There we go. So now that switch isn't going to move around on us. It's secure. And we're going to test that trigger again. Unfortunately, our trigger isn't performing like it just was earlier. So back to square one, we're going to pop it off, keep the wires in place. We're going to either tighten that spring or squish this little orange one again, as we mentioned, and we're just going to start troubleshooting this again to get it to work, because these wires being added just a little bit more friction technically. So we'll start troubleshooting. Okay, so that actually wasn't too hard. We just had to squish this spring down a little bit more, and we found a sweet spot already, so we got pretty lucky there. With that out of the way, we are going to now put on our XT60 connector. We're going to feed the wires through the handle, clear out the bottom, and bring it up here. We're not going to attach it completely. We just want it to sit there so we can see how long we need to cut our wires to. And we want to be able to attach a battery, obviously. So we're going to snip it about right here, just so there's enough so we can actually get a grip on it when we install the battery. What we can do now is I just tinned these real quick. I'm letting them cool. We're going to come back to that. We're going to grab this left side of the barrel, and we are going to slide it in here. Notice that it's going to fit under this piece, and then just like the other half on the other side. And we're going to put a screw in right here. Now what we're going to do is we are going to test to make sure our motors are going to spin the right direction when we put it into the into this connector. So I'm just going to pinch a little AA right here between my fingers. And I'm going to actually engage the hammer. When I pull this back, you hear that? Those motors are actually spinning. And I'm just going to feel it with my finger to make sure they're spinning the correct direction. Okay, so I noticed that they are spinning the correct direction. Imagine a dart flinging out, and that tells me that red is positive and black is negative. And there are corresponding markings on the XT60 connector. Okay, so now we're going to cut 2 more pieces of heat shrink, about that long, like 5/8 of an inch-ish. we're going to slide it over these two wires. And now we're going to remember this is negative, so negative goes on the top here, and we're going to connect these. What we're going to do now is we're going to be installing the drum arm and this little top barrel. What I recommend first is that you just do a little bit of lube on this arm in the hole and on the other side as well, because it's going to be rubbing a little bit, not too much. There we go. And this little short fat pin is going to feed through this little hole, this groove here, and then through here and kind of click into place. I'll try my best to show you as we go. Obviously this points backwards. We're going to slide it in there, kind of pinch everything together, and then we're going to tuck this pin in there. And then we're going to push it all the way in. You'll know it's all the way in when you can see a little bit of orange right there coming out the trigger guard. And just like that, the drum arm is installed. Now what we can do is we can put a full-length screw right here. You'll notice this screw will snag if the pin isn't in there all the way, so really make sure the pin is in there all the way. And now that pin won't be falling out. Looking good. Next, we're going to put on this top piece. It's going to feed on like so. Make sure you don't cut or pinch the wires here. Make sure that they're tucked in. And then it just feeds on like that. Give it a bit of a tap. There we go. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to take 2 screws and screw those in. You'll notice that there are holes on either side. It doesn't matter which side you put the screws in. Okay, so we're getting warmer. Let's keep going. We're going to just check, make sure our trigger is still working okay. Looking great. Now, we are going to attach the iron sight on top to finish kind of securing all these things together. To assemble the iron sight, you're going to make sure that the supports are off of this guy, that it's nice and clean. And this is going to slide into this housing here. And then you can actually look through it and you can see, there you go, you can see where the pin is going to go. We're going to use this entire pin. We're not going to cut it or anything. And we're going to tap it in there. Make sure those holes are lined up, otherwise you'll break the iron sight. There we go, tapped it in. And we're ready to roll. What's going to happen now is there are going to be 4 screws full length that go here, and then obviously through here into this entire trigger mechanism. Careful not to over tighten these top 4 screws because this iron sight's pretty thin and you can actually break it a little bit. But there we go, now it's nice and secure, pretty sturdy, looking good. And now it's just always a good idea to test as you go. We're going to throw the handle on, and with all this bolted down, hopefully our trigger still works. All right, obviously not looking so hot. So just like before, gonna take it apart, slide this panel off by, I'm gonna need to take off these 2 screws now, and this one down here. Slide the panel off, work with the springs again to get it working. Okay, really getting to the home stretch here. That was a bit of a chore. So the spring that I was using is one that we had experimented with and worked most of the time. However, like I said, there are so many variables and lots of things that happen differently. So I ended up actually switching out the spring, as you might have seen in that time lapse. But remember, we're going to send you guys a spring that should work. It should just work. We're going to send you guys a spring that works. And we've got one chosen out. We were just out of those today, actually. So we have these tightened down. I put the handle on. It's not bolted on, but the trigger and everything are working, which is a huge relief because that's one of the most difficult parts of this blaster. So we've got everything tightened down. Still working. Honestly, like if you look away from this, it's going to stop working. It's kind of funny, honestly. We're going to attach the handle now. What we're going to do is we're going to use a half-length screw in this spot only. The rest are going to be full-length screws. So half-length screw here, full length, and then on the other side, they're all full length. So let's attach the handle. We got the handle on. With everything secure, we don't have everything on just yet, but with this much done, what we're going to do now is we are going to test this drum and make sure that it rotates. So there are a couple things to look out for here. As you can already see, it's kind of a weird fit there. What happens sometimes is there is a bit of gunk left over from the printer. Just going to try and get any hairs that may be in there out. Just that way it fits all the way on to the arm. Oh, see that? That fell out. That looks like that was in the way. And then what should happen is it should close nicely. Sometimes this extension will rub against this groove here. If that is the case, then just let it fall. Oh, or if that is the case, then just file this down a little bit or take a knife to it. But it should be able to fall into place, and then you push the tab in and it lands in its spot. When we rotate it, we should hear some clicking. And now, moment of truth is, let's see if it rotates. Not looking so hot. It needs a little bit of help, it looks like. So I can already tell what's going on. We have been, like I said, making some small bits and bobs changes here and there to adapt to our printers and hardware. And what's actually happening here is our trigger has a little bit of a notch that pops out there. You see that? Not the pusher, but the actual trigger there. That is probably too long, and that is likely the issue. So I'm going to file that down a little bit because it's prematurely snagging onto this and therefore causing it to stop rotating. Some other issues may be that the rotator arm is not all the way in its groove. It's not returning to its groove properly. If that is the case, like I said earlier, make sure that that groove is clean and that the spring on the rotator arm isn't deformed or anything. Additionally, make sure the hammer inside there is nice and lubed so that way things can move freely. But as you fire, you should be able to see that rotator arm do the work there. So if it's looking like that, you should be good to go. That's why my hypothesis at the moment is that it's that trigger. So I'm going to be filing that down for a moment. To file it, I'm going to use a small file. And I'm actually just going to pull the trigger ever so slightly so it sticks out just a little bit. And then I'm just going to file it a little bit shorter. So imagine there's kind of that ridge on the trigger. I'm just shaving it a little bit shorter. Likely, you won't have to do this because we're going to be changing these files as we go. So that's already a lot better. It still snags a little bit here and there. So let's take off a little bit more. All right, we got it. It rotates, which is great. It can be a bit of a pain, but we've done a lot of troubleshooting with this, so it's coming along. If you are having issues, make sure that your drum printed correctly. Make sure that this hole fits onto that peg in there. Make sure it's not too loose. Like I said, you might need to file down that little trigger spot. Additionally, you may just need to double check your overall trigger resetting in general. Make sure that the drum thing, I don't know what to call it, is actually coming into the drum and fitting properly. But yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of things that can go wrong here. But we've been fortunate to see things come together smoothly. So maybe you can't even tell that it's rotating, but it actually is. So that's great. Let's finish bolting it together. Okay, so now we're just going to be installing the front iron sight and put in these two orange pieces, as well as making sure the battery cover works properly. So this part's a piece of cake. You just pop it into that hole, easy peasy. This one, you notice that there's a lip here. Yours may not have a lip. We'll see. It's something we're experimenting with it to make sure it fits properly. There we go, nice and snug. And we can coil these wires up in here, and let's make sure this battery cover fits nicely. This can be a bit rough sometimes, but it looks like ours is pretty smooth. There we go. But for safety's sake, yeah, that's pretty stuck. I'm gonna go ahead and just add a little bit of lube. If you don't want to lube it, you can of course file it until things work smoothly. So technically a full-length screw is going to go in here, but we're going to get to that later. We've got these things secure. We're going to make sure that this spot is clean. And we are going to put on the iron sight. This is going to be a full-length screw. That's just going to go straight down through here. As you screw it in, really pay attention to see when it hits this orange piece. It actually will hit this orange piece eventually. So it's up to you. You can kind of drill into that orange piece. Or you can stop about right there and you won't puncture this at all. And the screw will still be hidden and the iron sight will still be secure. So, look at that. Looking good. Awesome. Last thing here. So we've got a couple screws to throw into this bit here. We never finished screwing in this one. We're going to pinch this closed and finish that. And we are going to put a screw through this piece and into this hole. This is a bit tricky because they're so small. Okay, we got it. Nice and secure there. And everything's still working. So if your rotation turned out correctly, it's going to look something like this. Obviously, as I've been clicking like crazy, but you also should be able to pull the trigger just little intervals and rotate it individually. And of course, the full rotations. Your drum should not double rotate. That should not be happening. If it does, like I said, you might need to go back and troubleshoot a bit. But that is the Magpie, all bolted together. There it is. Really, really cool blaster. And it honestly, just the stuff that goes on in here is just so impressive. But quite the satisfying build to get it all done and working. And honestly, you don't even need a battery to have fun with it. It's just fun to click it around. Pew, pew, pew. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to get ready to test fire. First thing we're going to do is we're going to put in this battery here. Getting a battery to fit in these blasters is always a bit of a trial, so a bit of a puzzle. So I'm going to do my best here. But general rule is just be gentle. Don't force anything. There we go. Everything's in there. And we're ready to start test firing. Flywheelers can be a bit picky about the darts that they use. The length, the width, the head type, it all comes into play as to how well it fires. What we've observed with the Magpie so far is that workers work, as well as, Wafflehead and other types, Adventure Force, etc. However, we've found that these drums are a little tight for the time being, so darts they can get stuck and they'll actually just kind of scuff at the motors, just make the motors stall. Obviously, not ideal, it kind of jams. But what we found is the older dart you use, the better it performs. Or in other words, if the dart is just a little bit worn, so that way it's technically a little bit thinner and fits a little smoother in the drum here, then it's going to work better. So we have some new worker darts here. I'm trying to kind of simulate some wear on them to make them fit a little better. So we'll see how this goes. And there you have it, the Magpie.